We are on the record at 2:56 p.m. The date today is March 15, 2017. This marks the beginning of disc number 1 of the video retirement log of Judge Walter Kurtz, being taken on behalf of the Tennessee Bar Association. This video retirement log is being held at Gullett, Sanford, Robertson, and Martin, PLLC, 150 3rd Avenue South, Suite 1700, Nashville, Tennessee. My name is Heather Watkins with Franklin Pro Video Services, located in Franklin, Tennessee. I am the legal videographer. You may now proceed with the video retirement log.
Good afternoon. My name is Gareth Aden, and I'm here on behalf of the Nashville Bar Association and its Historical Committee to take the oral history of one of Middle Tennessee's esteemed jurists, Walter Kurtz. Walter, if you would, let's begin as we would a deposition, and I'll ask you to give your full name, please, sir.
Okay, Walter C. Kurtz.
And could you give us the date of your birth and where you were born?
August 14, 1943, in Binghamton, New York.
And I think Binghamton is right near Elmira, is that correct?
It is.
And did you grow up in Elmira?
I did. When I was 3 years old, we moved to Elmira. And that's where I went to school for the first 9 years. Now, as it happened, in the 9th grade, my father, who worked for General Electric, was transferred back to Binghamton. And I went back to Binghamton when I was 14 and graduated from high school in Binghamton. But then later, when I was in the Army 5 or 6 years later, my parents moved, when my dad retired, he moved back to Elmira. So I've always called Elmira my home.
Could you tell us a little bit about Elmira? I think is what they call upstate New York.
We pridefully call it upstate New York, 230 miles from New York City.
And I believe it's associated with many folks who know with Mark Twain. Is that correct?
It is. Mark Twain is buried in Elmira.
Tell us, if you can, a little bit about your mom and your dad.
Well, my dad grew up in the Army. His father was a career Army officer. My father lived in Minnesota, Maryland, Arizona, California, but he ended up going to college at Johns Hopkins, which we normally think of for doctors, but they have an undergraduate school. And then he worked for General Electric for most of his adult life, I think 42 years. And he worked for the apparatus sales division, which sells turbines and generators and large electric transformers. And he really worked, I think, between Syracuse, Elmira, and Binghamton. And he pretty much had one customer, New York State Electric and Gas. Sort of like a lawyer I know that represents one railroad.
How about your mom?
Well, my mom just grew up in Binghamton and graduated from high school in Binghamton and met my dad when he was there. And so she didn't get too far from home. Elmira was about as far from home as she ever lived.
Now, did anybody have to suffer through childhood with you as a brother?
My sister, whose name is Candace, his formal name, is 18 months younger than I am. And Candy graduated from high school and then went to New York University and Brooklyn Law School. And then she spent her entire professional career as a public defender in New York City, in Brooklyn for a while, and then finally in Manhattan for about the last 20 years of her career, and then retired just 2 years ago.
Well, you know, that leads to the question, was there something about your mom or your dad that had an interest in law practice, or was it just...
You know, I really don't think so narrowly, but my parents were always interested in politics and history. We talked about politics and history around the table the dinner table, and I think that got my sister and I interested in politics and sort of got us there to the legal profession. Now, one thing I should mention about my mother was that she was the chairperson of the Chemung County, New York Republican organization for many years.
You know, they ask me, and I'm going to ask you because it's important many times to people who want to know, what was your dad's full name?
Walter Reamer Kurtz.
And your mother?
Marion Cotton Kurtz. Her last name, maiden name was Cotton.
So as I understand it, you went to elementary school both in Binghamton and then in Elmira. And then where did you go to high school?
Well, in high school, I went to elementary school in Binghamton, or excuse me, in Elmira, from K through 8. And then in the 9th grade, we moved to Binghamton, and I graduated from high school in Binghamton.
Right. Was that, what was your high school there?
Binghamton North High School.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about how you did grade-wise in high school, and what else, what type of extracurricular activities you did.
Well, I would not call myself an excellent student, but I did well enough to subsequently get into college. My extracurricular activities were, I was on the tennis team and the swim team.
I think the tennis, your interest in tennis and love of it has followed you even till today.
Well, my father was a big tennis player, and a very good tennis player, and I've never been a very good tennis player, but I love the sport, and I'm enthusiastic about it and still play some.
Did you and the family take any big vacations or special events that happened during your childhood? Did you travel a lot?
Well, we went to Canada. There was another couple with children about the same age as me and my sister, and we traveled to Canada several times with them to northern Ontario, and then once to the Gaspé Peninsula. My dad took me camping in the Adirondacks, and we'd once in a while, my dad, like I mentioned, New York City was 230 miles away, but we'd go down to watch a baseball, for a weekend to watch baseball.
What, in high school, what grades or what topics or subjects did you do the best in?
Well, I think I did the best in, history-related and math and science, which always somewhat surprised me. Did not do that well in languages and somewhat a little not too aspiring in perhaps English composition. And spelling, I was terrible.
Let's come to sort of the time when you were 17 and you were thinking about graduating and going on to college. What thoughts did you have?
Well, I got it in my head that I wanted to be a career Army officer. My grandfather on my father's side had been a career Army officer. My grandfather on my mother's side had been in the New York National Guard for his career, and I decided to apply to the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina, and I was accepted, and off I went. I actually arrived at the Citadel when I was still 17, although I turned 18 a couple weeks after my birthday's in mid-August.
What year would that have been?
1961.
Did you have any idea really what you were getting into?
No.
Tell us about that.
Well, and like a lot of experiences in life, I mean, you look at something and it looks sort of interesting, maybe even romantic, and of course, those were the days, and Gareth, you know this, where you didn't have these college tours that you went on. You got a catalog in the mail, and you looked at this and you said, well, this is interesting. I think I'll apply here. And so I had never been south of Richmond, Virginia when I went to the Citadel in August 1961, nor do you ever quite realize the reality of the military environment. It's just one of those experiences that you just have to go through to really completely understand, even if you read about it beforehand.
What's it like to be a plebe there at the Citadel in Charleston back in the...
Well, in the words of the upperclassmen, to be a plebe at the Citadel is to be the lowest form of life. And you had to walk in the gutter, you had to stand at attention anytime an upperclassman was nearby. You weren't allowed on any stairs. When an upperclassman wanted to use the stairs, the first word out of your mouth was "sir." You had to brace. That's stand at a rigid attention with your chin tucked in. At the table to eat, you had to ask for the food. You know, we went to drill a couple times a week. Oh, every meal we stood formation to march to the mess hall. We lived in barracks, not dormitories.
And I understand.
They're called barracks.
I understand that the disciplinary system is pretty radical too.
Well, it was. Some of the upperclassmen were abusive of their authority, and there was some cruelty involved in which some upperclassmen were actually disciplined and dismissed from the school. The other thing about the Citadel, it has a rigid honor code system, which is nothing to trifle with.
What types of things, if you, for instance, didn't answer a question correctly or got out of line, what types of things could an upperclassman make you do?
Well, in your face, I mean, you would do push-ups or perhaps be sent to run around the quadrangle, which is the interior part of the barracks, almost in civilian terms like a plaza inside the building. You've probably seen them. The other thing is that you picked up demerits for not having your shoes shined or your belt buckle shined or your rifle's not clean, and if you got more than a certain number of demerits, you had to serve confinements. That would be an hour in your room, which were on Saturdays and Sundays, so that meant you couldn't leave campus. And then the other thing you could pick up were tours. A tour is an hour on the quadrangle in the main barracks where you just walk back and forth. You're not allowed to speak, and you just walk from one end of the quadrangle to the other, make an about face, and walk back to the other for 1 hour for one tour.
Now there's a rumor, and of course it's only a rumor, that you became right famous on campus for rebelling against the system. Is that something you can tell us about?
Well, I don't know if I became for rebellion, but I was involved in one of the most famous pranks at the Citadel when 7 of us who were not happy with the company first sergeant, who was a cadet, a senior cadet, smuggled in some cinder blocks and cement, and then when he came in one Saturday night, we snuck out of our rooms and blocked built a cinder block wall in his door, so that the next Sunday morning formation, he couldn't get out of his room. It became quite a famous incident at the Citadel. In fact, there's a photograph of it in one of Pat Conroy's books, his first book called The Boo. And it's also written about in one of his other books, The Lords of Discipline.
Well, now, did you get away with this, or did you have to pay the price?
No, the cadet battalion commander, a battalion would be 4 companies, one barracks, just restricted the entire battalion until somebody confessed, and the 7 of us figured that no one would believe that one person did it, so we actually drew straws, and I ended up losing, along with another cadet, Mike Thompson, and so we went up and confessed. You could look at it a couple ways. One way was that we became instant celebrities around campus, and quite notorious, really, among the other, admired by the other cadets that we had done this. And the assistant commandant of cadets, who's a retired lieutenant colonel in the Army, I think years later told me that he thought it was a pretty, neat thing to do. Years later, he told me, but and so the punishment we received was actually sort of moderated by that under the circumstances. We got 1 month confinement to the campus and 20 tours, which could have been a lot worse than that. In fact, some people, you can get 6 months confinement. You can actually pick up 120 tours if your disciplinary violation is egregious enough.
How did you like the Citadel?
Well, I think I didn't like being a plebe, but I stuck it out, and once you stick it out, you're so sort of bonded and committed to the system, you don't leave. Now, they have a lot of people drop out, and a lot of people drop out during the plebe year, and some people don't come back after the plebe year.
How were your grades?
My grades, well, let's put it this way. After I got out of the Army, they were good enough to get into Vanderbilt Law School. Now, they were actually pretty, they were excellent in history, political science, and a couple of courses like physics. They were not good in French or some English classes, but it was, I graduated.
Did you like Charleston? Being from, upstate New York?
I love Charleston. I think it's one of the most beautiful cities in the U.S. It's an extraordinary place. Of course, sometimes a place like that is wasted on the young, but on those weekends when we could get out, we'd go to the beach, to the Isle of Palms or Folly Beach. I can't say as a 19-year-old we spent much time in the beautiful churches and other places that I visited later in my adult years, but we certainly took advantage of the beaches, and it's a beautiful city.
As you got into your third year and had to make decisions about the future, did you change your mind about the military life?
Well, I did. I mean, that was a decision I made in about 1963 not to sign the every Citadel cadet takes ROTC, and in that time maybe 65% of the cadets went in the military, but you didn't have to go in the military, even though you had to comply with all the military requirements. And at the end of your, what you call sophomore year, what we called our third classmen, we're given the opportunity to sign a ROTC contract, which would then have given us an automatic commission. Well, there was no war really going on in 1963, and because everybody trusted Lyndon Johnson, that we only had a few advisors in Vietnam. So I didn't sign the contract, and when I graduated from the Citadel, I went off to UT Graduate School in political science in the fall of 1965.
You know, before we get to that, I think you had some fascinating summers while you were in college, and tell us a little bit about what you did in the summer, just a little bit.
Well, the first summer after my freshman year, I actually hitchhiked from Binghamton all the way across the country to through Texas, Arizona, into California. I came, I had an aunt that lived in Monterey. I spent a couple days with her, and then I hitchhiked up into the Grand Tetons and went to climbing school there, climbed the Grand Teton, climbed the Middle Teton, and then hitchhiked back. 2 summers later, having had that good experience, I hitchhiked across the Trans-Canadian Highway through western Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, and British Columbia. But for 3 weeks in Alberta, I actually stopped and worked at a resort hotel in Jasper, Alberta, and then hitchhiked back when I got down to Washington, Oregon, and came back through the Dakotas and Michigan into upstate New York. But as you well know, in 1962, 1964, it was a different world.
Yeah.
And
absolutely,
it would take a total fool to hitchhike now, but people were wonderfully friendly and generous, and I never had any incident that would be, you know, to indicate of any danger in any of this, except one guy in Michigan picked me up. He was only dangerous because he was drinking Everclear grain alcohol, and I really thought I better get out of the car at the next little town, because he seemed quite attached to his Everclear grain alcohol.
You mentioned just a moment ago that when you graduated from the Citadel, you decided to go to the University of Tennessee and study there for a while in graduate school. What did you study?
Political science. I was a political science major.
Okay. And how long did you stay at the
Well, I was
university?
there. They still have the quarter system, so I was there from, I guess, September '65 to maybe May of '66. I completed the coursework for my master's degree, but never wrote my thesis. But by the spring of '66, the war, the Vietnam, our involvement in Vietnam had turned into a real war, and you know, no Citadel graduate could sit out a war. So
that just wasn't going to happen.
I enlisted, but didn't get a direct commission because I, you know, turned it down. So I went to basic training, advanced infantry training, OCS, and then a special school in Fort Sill before I was sent to Vietnam.
What position in the Army, or what group in the Army did you train for?
Well, the training I had at Fort Sill was to train me for a communication platoon leader in a either infantry, armor, or artillery unit. So actually, when I first went to Vietnam, I was put on a division staff for a short period of time, but then I was sent to Armored Cavalry Squadron, where I mostly commanded the communications platoon. I say mostly because for a period of time in December of '68 through February of '69, I was given command of a reconnaissance platoon. And the Armored Cavalry Squadron was in the 1st Infantry Division. Just one little footnote. Very few units in the modern-day Army were involved in the Civil War, because the Civil War was mostly fought with state units, both southern and from northern states. So you see like the 24th New York Infantry,
Right.
But actually there were several regular Army cavalry squadrons, among them the 4th Cavalry Regiment, which was actually here at the Battle of Nashville. And I was in the 4th Cavalry Regiment. And that was the 1st Squadron, 4th Cavalry of the 1st Infantry Division. So my wife still has a hard time who's a Middle Tennessee native, has a hard time dealing with the fact that she's married to a Yankee cavalry officer.
Your tour was, what, about a year in Vietnam?
May of '68 to May of '69.
Were you there where combat was taking place?
I was. We spent, the cavalry squadron spent a lot of time in the field.
Yep. And I know from, being a friend of yours for years that even though the war itself might have been unpopular, you do have a great deal of respect for the military.
Oh, absolutely, and I'm very proud of my service in the Army.
As your tour of duty drew to an end, did you have any plans for what you were going to do?
Well, yes. While I was in the Army, I decided I wanted to apply and go to law school. I'd actually applied to UT Law School when I was in graduate school and had been accepted, but that had been aborted by my enlistment in the Army. So I applied to Vanderbilt and William and Mary, I think Georgetown and George Washington, and I ended up at Vanderbilt.
Why Vandy?
Well, I'd come over here a couple times when I was living in Knoxville, and I liked Nashville, and Vanderbilt Law School had a good reputation. My then wife was a South Carolinian. I don't know that she wanted to get too far away from home, so it seemed like a great place to go.
Right. While you were in law school, you just mentioned that you were married. Did you have to work?
I did. I worked at what we now call legal aid, but legal services. I worked the summer after my second year, and I worked the summer after I graduated, but I also, during my second and third year of law school, worked at legal services. I remember a couple of weeks during my senior year, I put in over 30 hours a week. I remember that because we got paid by the hour, so we kept our timesheets.
How did law school and Vanderbilt, how did they suit you?
I think they suited me well. I enjoyed it. I was older and more mature in my my obligations to my coursework and did better in law school. It was a more serious law student than I had been a college student. But I enjoyed the whole idea of the law, of dealing with people's concrete problems, whether they were business, domestic, criminal. The whole idea of being a lawyer attracted me.
Which, during your 3 years there, which professors or courses sort of stand out in your mind?
Well, I liked Professor McCoy a lot in contracts. I liked Professor Hartman, who I didn't have in contracts, which some people had him in state and local government, but thought he was a great teacher. I liked Ted Smedley. There are one or two exceptions which we won't mention, but I thought 80% of the teachers were fine, each and good. Some had different personalities, but I thought it was a very positive experience. Now, I was lucky to have Don Payne, who was a Knoxville lawyer, but a great expert on evidence law, and we still carry his book, Payne on Evidence. He would come over from Knoxville and teach for an hour and a half on a Wednesday afternoon, and then the other hour and a half the next Thursday morning for the 3-hour course, and then go back to Knoxville. He was a superb teacher. I should mention, we talked, I had Dean Wade for torts. He was a good teacher.
Yeah. And I think your friendship with Don Payne lasted over the years, didn't it?
Well, yes, and as a judge, of course, I had a lot to do with him. He always came to the judicial conferences and taught evidence, and he was always available for consultation on tricky evidence issues, but he also had a sort of an engaging personality and a way of expressing himself. And enjoyed country music.
Very good. It's obvious now looking back, but your interest went to the trial law end of things, but was that sort of a conscious item, or was it something that the legal services work that you did or contributed to?
Well, I always thought of lawyers as being in court. Now, I know that's not entirely accurate, and in fact, a good majority of lawyers don't go to court. But that's sort of what attracted me, the advocacy, the taking problems to either go to court or be on a track to go to court. So I guess the answer to your question is yes. Especially when I was younger, and it was exciting being at legal aid because, for better or worse, legal aid lawyers were just thrown into the cauldron right away. And I mean by that was that I would sometimes go to court and see some of my law school classmates, and they were just sort of second chairing an older lawyer in the law firm. It was a good way to learn, and there's a downside, surely, to not being mentored properly. But I sure got a lot of responsibility and a lot of action fast.
Did you actually get an opportunity to try a case before you graduated?
I did. I was allowed at legal aid to practice as a third-year student. There's a Tennessee Supreme Court rule that allows that as long as you're supervised by a lawyer. And I actually had the opportunity to try a very sort of odd civil commitment case before a jury in front of Judge Joe Lozer with John Toon, believe it or not, on the other side. He'd been hired by the family involved. It involved a young man who'd actually been found not guilty by reason of insanity 7 years before for killing his father in Hamilton County. But now some of the doctors say he was no longer civilly committable and should be released. And there was a challenge to that in a jury trial, and I represented the young man. John Toon was hired by the family to try to keep him in the hospital, and after a 2-day trial, the jury found in favor of Mr. Toon's position. But it was a great experience.
It had to be. What a thrill as a student to do that. Walter, in terms of your classmates, I think there's some folks that we have in practice now in Nashville that you went to school with. Am I right?
Well, you know, Tom White, Tad Harris, Gary Blackburn, Bob Trenum, John Williams. I'm sure there's a lot I'm not thinking about, but as you know, a lot of Vanderbilt graduates stick around town. And
you know, looking back again, before we leave your law school years, what affected law school, or anything about the law school experience that you'd like to mention, or the whole idea of being a law student?
Well, I mean, I think law school teaches you to think with some exactitude, and that's sometimes frustrating for people who are not lawyers, who sometimes speak in like regular people with vagaries. The other thing it makes you, I think, is while you have your own personal philosophy or ideology, if you will, it certainly teaches you to be tolerant of other people's ideas, and to, you know, channel conflict. I think a wonderful thing about the law is that, with some exception, and especially in the day you and I came up, you could fight in court and go out in the hallway and be friends, and oftentimes have lunch together. Gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we could export that up to the U.S. Congress?
Really?
Let them fight about
Really?
Policy, but they don't need to be personal about it. And I think most lawyers are like that. And I think law school lays the groundwork or the foundation for that approach.
All right, we're now, I think, in 1972. You're graduating from a successful stint at law school. What did you decide to do?
Well, I'd had this part-time job at Legal Aid. I just stayed. Maybe not very imaginative, but I was hired as a staff attorney, and they were exciting times at Legal Aid. As you may know, years later, Congress acted to strip Legal Aid of the authority to file class action lawsuits and do what was maybe called law reform. I say they did that. They put that as a condition to the federal money that came to Legal Aid. But that wasn't the case in the 1970s. And so I was involved in lawsuits related to the conditions at the Metro Jail, conditions in the prison, conditions at Clover Bottom Hospital, the jailing of indigents for non-payment of fines, and a host of cases against the Department of Human Services, then called the Department of Welfare, because they just sort of ignored the time requirements imposed on them by federal regulation. But those were the days when oftentimes state agencies were not called into account for violation of constitutional decisions nor federal regulations. I mean, those days are sort of over, and in a way, those lawsuits, you didn't have to be a great lawyer to win these lawsuits. You just had to have the moxie to file them, because here, Judge, here's a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, and Judge Morton or Judge Gray would say, yes, state's attorney, you have to follow what the U.S. Supreme Court says. I mean, so there was not much subtlety to these lawsuits.
A few questions about Legal Services of Nashville. Number one, when you began there as a staff attorney in 1972, how many people were on the staff?
You know, I should be a little better than this, but I think there were between maybe 11 and 13 lawyers. A couple of the lawyers came on a grant from the Legal Services Corporation, but I think we had them. You know, I mean, you knew Ashley Wiltshire, of course, and then
David Tarpley was
there.
Another
and Russ Overby.
Exactly.
And
now, am I wrong? But it seems to me that fairly quickly you became the director here in Nashville. How did that? What happened?
Well, the director when I was hired was a gentleman named Dave Candish, and in 1973, Dave left to become a juvenile court referee here in Davidson County, and Dave recommended a gentleman to succeed him named Warren, and the board, I guess, perhaps distracted or just thinking that it was an easy way out, immediately hired Mr. Warren, I think almost sight unseen. There may have been some interview. But Mr. Warren, let's just say, without going too deeply, he had some problems. As a result, Mr. Warren resigned in less than 3 months, and so the board was sort of, I don't know, in a quandary. They had hired him, it hadn't worked out, and I think maybe they didn't want to start the process again. So I think it was, I mean, well, I think several mentioned it. I mean, there were a whole group of young lawyers there. I was no better lawyer than any of the other lawyers there, including Ashley and Dave Candish and the like, but I think because of my Army experience, they decided, well, we'll just put Kurtz in charge. So there I was, less than a year out of law school, and I was appointed director.
It's a big job, and did you get support from people who were on the board of the Legal Services?
The board was great. Brad Reed, Howard, Billy Howard, which
Bill Howard,
you would have
Metro
known.
Legal Department.
Who had been at Bolt before. Right. Billy was then the chairman, but he went off, and Brad Reed became the chairman. And Bob Ziegler was a longtime treasurer. Joe Haynes, the Goodlettsville lawyer and state senator, not the federal judge, was on the board. But the board was always very supportive. And I talked earlier about not having a mentor. If anybody, it was Bob Ziegler. I mean, I'd take files down to Bob's office, and he'd give me advice on cases. He's just a wonderful man and so supportive of legal services. Another person who is just a really a hero in supporting legal services was Joe Cummings, who I know you knew. There was an incident later when, because of these class action lawsuits against the Department of Human Services, when the commissioner of the Department of Human Services actually went to the UGF board. UGF gave us some money, maybe about 10%, to try to defund us. And Joe went in front of the board and just, was just
he stood up.
Superb
Yeah.
in telling the board of UGF that we were doing exactly what we ought to do, and that the commissioner of welfare ought to be ashamed of himself for coming down there because he couldn't get the department to follow federal regulations.
A lot of this was new, and I was, just beginning my practice in that period, but I'm interested in your perspective. How did the Nashville bench and bar accept the concept of legal services?
Well, there were a few people that didn't like it. One person that stood out as was hostile to the whole idea of socialized law practice was Dick Lansden, who had some clout, didn't like it. And of course, there were some lawyers who economically were on the fringe, who thought we were somehow a rival for their, indigent clients. I'd say that, and a few of the judges were a little hostile to the idea of legal aid. Harry Lester, who was later one of my colleagues, was not particularly friendly to legal aid, but I think most of the judges were accepting and maybe even glad to have us. But there was some hostility out there, but we did fine.
My recollection is that there was some at the beginning, but pretty quickly it dissipated.
It did.
It really did.
It did.
You mentioned some cases that you were very proud of. One, I think, had to do with Clover Bottom.
It did. The hospital then called for the retarded. I think we now refer to folks with just people with developmental disabilities, but that hospital, which was run by the state, the conditions at the hospital were simply terrible, atrocious. 60, 70 residents were sometimes put in a dormitory room with the beds no more than 2 feet apart. They were severely retarded, oftentimes unable to communicate. They were bathed by being hosed down. There was, fecal matter on the floor. There was no programs for them. It was just a terrible situation. The lawsuit in front of Judge Morton, though, accomplished two things. One, it declared the admissions statutes to the hospital unconstitutional. Those admission statutes essentially allowed a parent or other responsible person to, in essence, just drive up to the door and drop off the person they contended was, again, back to the old language, retarded. Those laws were declared unconstitutional. The hospital was required to have a hearing to determine if the facility was suitable to the person there. The second thing, and even more important, were the conditions at the hospital were then placed under a multi-faceted order from Judge Morton to clean the place up, to provide appropriate medical care, residents, and to discharge the residents to more community-based facilities if they didn't need to be in an institution like that. So it was a extraordinary thing, and the more than the lawyers, me among them, the plaintiffs were some of the social workers at the hospital who sued by the concept of next friend and put their their professional future on the line by lending their public support as plaintiffs by next friend to the residents.
During your 3.5 years as Director of Legal Services back in the mid-1970s, there was another case that I wanted to ask you about, and I don't want to overdo talking about that period, but I think you were involved in a lawsuit that had to do with the jailing of indigents.
Yes, for non-payment of fines, and the U.S. Supreme Court had decided a case called Tate versus Short. So again, back to what I mentioned 10 minutes ago, it was easy to get an order from the federal court that they not jail indigents for non-payment of fines unless they found that the non-payment was willful. But you can't squeeze blood out of turnip, and you can't jail somebody for just being poor. But now there was one General Sessions judge that just wasn't going to obey the order, and he refused to follow it. In fact, when presented by me with a motion, he crumpled it up and threw it back at me and said the federal court wasn't going to run the General Sessions Court of Davidson County. Well, that was ended in a sort of colorful ending, because the next morning a U.S. Marshal came into court and served him with a show cause order. Judge Morton happened to be out of town. Judge Gray was at his home in Franklin. Judge Gray decided he didn't want to come into the courthouse, that he was going to order this hearing in his library in Franklin. And Larry Snedeker, who was with Metro Legal then, and the judge went down there. I and 2 other legal aid lawyers went down there. The judge, the General Sessions judge was, let's just say, very apologetic, and assured the federal judge that he would obey the federal court order in the U.S. Supreme Court case because he didn't want to go to jail. And so I was then given a court order. They got the named plaintiff out, and I still remember her name, Jacqueline Parrish. Went into the jail. The sheriff released her. She went outside. There were all these cameras around, and she gave everybody the Black Power salute. And I felt like a genuine civil rights lawyer for the one time in my life.
Let's come to 1976. I believe that you left your director's position at Legal Services and went to the University of Tennessee.
I did.
What happened?
Well, I got offered the job in the legal clinic over there, and I was interested in practicing criminal law, which we didn't do at Legal Aid. That's a public defender's job. So, and I guess at the age of around 30 or so, or 31 or whatever I was, just wanted to sort of change. And so I left Legal Aid and went to work over there for 2 years. And it was a great experience, and I enjoyed it, and I tried some criminal cases over there and worked with students in getting them ready to do criminal cases, and taught a course in criminal constitutional procedure. But
So here you were just a few years out of law school, and you were Professor Kurtz.
Yes, but here's something you'll like, and I hope sometime some UT law graduate listens to this tape, but they won't. But there were 6 Vanderbilt Law graduates on the faculty at UT then. They needed us, Carol. They needed us at UT Law School.
Did you, in your work with the legal clinic, did you get to actually try some cases?
I did. I think I tried 3 felony cases before juries. I tried a lot. I actually tried a big murder case over there with a insanity defense, kind of an interesting case, and several other cases, and spent a lot of time in court, and I think the students got a lot out of it. We did preliminary hearings and misdemeanor trials. I mean, they did some of this under my supervision. Now, I did the felony trials and the jury trials.
Yeah. Did, as you got on into your second year, did opportunities arise in Nashville that you were interested in?
It did. I always thought, once I had this criminal experience, and I had some people had complained about the way the public defender's office was run here. To make a long story short, I came back and ran for public defender, and was elected.
This was 1978.
1978.
Tell us a little bit about how large the defender's office was and how it went.
Well, let's see. I think we had around 30 employees, maybe 15 lawyers. We had investigators and secretaries. Because we provided all the indigent services in the general sessions courts, in the 3 criminal courts, and in the juvenile court, which was, you know, a fairly significant caseload. It was, I do want to say a word about running for public defender, because it always, and being elected, because in a lot of states the public defenders are appointed. Tennessee has elected public defenders, and you could say, well, now how do you run as public defender? You tell people you're going to get the, you know, all the criminals off. Well, I found something about this community that was really, you know, sort of heartwarming in a way. That when you tell people about equal justice, and that the indigent defendants need quality representation, they shouldn't go to prison or whatever might happen because they have bad lawyers. You know, people respond positively to that. I mean, people don't want guilty people to get off, but on the other hand, they don't want the poor and the disadvantaged to not have decent lawyers. And I you know, would go to Rotary clubs and Kiwanis clubs and Antioch and Madison and Goodlettsville, and people always responded positively to that message. Now, before I became public defender, the public defender's office was part-time. They just had part-time lawyers. I immediately made the lawyers full-time. We were in 4 offices in the courthouse. I moved the public defender's office over to the Stallman building, where we had a lot more room. Hopefully I started the real professionalization of the office.
Well, that's the way it's seen at the bar, that you really, the advent of your heading the department seemed to bring it into almost a new state of being.
Well, I think changing it from part-time to full-time was the big step. And then you hire a group of young, enthusiastic lawyers, it makes a difference. And there really was no opposition. I think the judges appreciated the rise in the level of the representation. I think even the prosecutors did. They don't want their convictions upset by ineffective assistance of counsel, and the whole system runs better with a good public defender's office. Like we need good judges and we need good prosecutors in the criminal system.
A couple of questions about the 4 years that you spent as the Metropolitan Government Public Defender. One is, do I recall correctly that there was a case that you took all the way to the United States Supreme Court?
Yes, but that was a case that I actually picked up in Knoxville and stayed with it. When I worked at the legal clinic, I'd gone out to Brushy Mountain Prison, which is in Morgan County, about 50 miles west of Knoxville, and met these two convicted murderers who had at least got a federal magistrate on a habeas corpus in Memphis enough interested in this case that he had written a memorandum saying there might be something to it, and I wrote the federal judge, Judge Welford, and Judge Welford appointed me, and I represented them in the federal district court in Memphis and went to the Sixth Circuit and won the case. It had to do, the short story is, with discrimination, racial discrimination, selection of the grand jury, and a collateral issue which actually had some import in the habeas corpus law about the scope of the writ of habeas corpus. Anyways, I got to the U.S. Supreme Court and was able to argue before the court. And as any lawyer thinks that's like one of the most exciting things, if not the most exciting thing you can do. And as you know, it's just a matter of blind luck. I mean, there are some lawyers up there in Washington and New York that argue before the court for a living. But outside of that, for the rest of us out here in the provinces, it's just a matter of having the one case that might get you up there. I mean, Mr. Aiden, there might be a railroad case someday that'll get you up there.
Who was the state attorney general at that time?
Well, it was Bill Leach, and Bill actually argued the case, even though he didn't do the legwork on the case. That was done by an assistant attorney general named Mike Terry. But as you probably know, sometimes when the poor assistants do all the work and the U.S. Supreme Court decides to hear it, the attorney general says, "Well, I think I'll take over this case." So Mike, who did all the work, briefed Bill, and Bill argued. And coincidentally, that was the day before, the argument before the U.S. Supreme Court was the day before Governor Alexander was sworn in early in the great clemency for cash Blanton scandals. And so Bill, well, it didn't affect his argument. I don't mean he was distracted in his argument, but he was certainly had a couple things. He had that argument on Tuesday, and he had to get back to Nashville and deal with that early swearing in. So he certainly had his hands full in that 48-hour period.
How did your Supreme Court case come out?
Well, I won the issue on the habeas corpus, which was what was of great interest to the National Attorney General's Association. They were on the side of the state, and the Federal Civil Rights Division, which was on my side, although they didn't argue. So I won there. On the jury discrimination issue, even though I'd won before the Sixth Circuit, they thought that proof needed to be expanded, and they sent it back for a further hearing on that. So I guess you could say I lost on that part of it. Ironically, about 3 or 4 weeks after the case was remanded and then would have gone back to the federal district court, my two clients, who were members of the Black Panthers at Brushy Mountain, were killed by a member of the Aryan Brotherhood. And so the case was mooted. There was quite a bit of the Panthers in the prison and the Aryan Brotherhood were, extremely hostile to each other.
Yeah. Before we leave your tenure there at the Public Defender's Office, who were some of the other staff people who worked with you and who ended up succeeding you?
Well, let's see. I think you know Jim Weatherly. He worked with me, and then he also succeeded me as public defender. Bill Schulman, there was a guy named Bob Tucker, who later became the federal public defender in the Virgin Islands. Pat Newton, Mariah Wooten,
yes.
A guy named Bob O'Connell, a lot of people there. Rich McGee, gosh, I can't forget Rich McGee.
Yeah, he's a very successful defense lawyer now in Nashville. What about, what did you decide to do eventually after you'd served for 3.5 or so years?
Well, 82 was an election year, and people who muse about becoming judges have to realize it's a matter of being at the right place at the right time. And Steve North had announced he was going to resign to run for district attorney, and that left an opening there in the Fifth Circuit Court. Also, Raymond Leathers was going to leave in Division I, so that was going to be an open court. And John Draper was going to leave in Division II of the criminal court. I'm trying to remember if there was another opening then. But anyways, it was a good time to take that opportunity. It may never come again. And so I decided to run for circuit court judge.
Who sort of helped you or headed your campaign?
Well, Margaret Bim ended up really running the campaign. Her now husband, Harlan Dodson, was helpful. Jude Lenahan was involved in the campaign. I'll tell you who's a great yard sign maker is Bill Koch. And I should have mentioned him earlier as one of my law school classmates, but he was then an assistant attorney general, and he spent a lot of time bruising his thumb making Kurtz for judge yard signs.
Who did you have to run against?
Well, Carol McCoy also wanted the position, so she and I ran against each other in the Democratic primary, which I won. And then Rose Cantrell had been appointed by Governor Alexander to fill that position after Steve North resigned, but that was really a short term. But Rose ran as a Republican, and I won that contest in August, and then took office on September 1, 1982.
Was it what you thought it would be to be a circuit court or trial level judge?
Well, I think it was. I know some judges have taken office and not had much trial experience, but gosh, I had been, public defender. I'd been in the circuit court a lot.
You had tried jury cases in law school. I mean, really.
Right. And so now it's hard. I think it takes you about 18 months to begin to think of yourself as a judge rather than a lawyer who happens to be a judge. And that may not make sense to anybody who wasn't a judge, what I just said, but and then you sometimes, before you get through that 18-month period, you sometimes worried. I was doing some criminal cases, and I kept being concerned, well, gosh, you know, the state's going to think I favor the public defenders, and the public defenders are going to think I'm going to do them a favor. Am I going to overreact or underreact? And I mean, but then after 18 months, you don't even think about that anymore, and you're just a judge, and you stop thinking about that. But it does remind me, we had the reporter for the Tennessean, who I'm sure you remember, Kurtz.
Yes, very well.
And every time I ruled against the state, and it was newsworthy, he would put Walter Kurtz, comma, former public defender, comma, today suppressed evidence. I mean, it was always, I could never sort of get over it. And, you know, and most of the criminal judges had been former assistant DAs, but they didn't get, you know,
the same line.
They didn't get the former assistant DA if they, you know, ruled that way, but.
Well, you know, as a lawyer who's never been a judge, I've wondered what the most difficult parts of becoming a judge and wanting to do well, but not being certain about what to do. And I just wondered what your experience had been.
Well, I don't know that I can have a definitive answer, except that, you know, sometimes it's very difficult to make a decision. I mean, some are emotional problems. I mean, we can talk about it, but even intellectually. I remember, and I'm sure you remember, you know, we sat in those law school seminars, and the 8 of us would be here with a professor, and the professors would say, now, we need to identify the issue. And so we talk about it, and he says, well, okay, you've identified the issue. That's what's important. You don't have to decide this. Well, the judge has not only got to identify the issue, he's got to go one way or the other. And that can be difficult on occasion. And you know, there's no judge that doesn't understand that on occasion he or she is going to make a mistake. But, you know, I think lawyers appreciate a decisive judge rather than somebody who just can't get around to making a decision. I've even heard some lawyers say, I guess I used to think this, make a bad decision. It's better than making no decision. And so, of course you want to get it right, but, you know, you got to do the best you can, make a decision. I say emotional issues, though, like, you know, in determining sentencing in significant criminal cases, it's sometimes hard to decide, you know, whether are you going to be punitive, or are you going to take a chance on this person? And then some of the things you see in criminal cases, violent crimes, murders, child sex abuse, are just, oh gosh, they just tear you up. But you've got to maintain your sort of stoic approach to all this.
You were called on often to sort of take off the robe as a civil judge and do criminal work, and I guess this is because of the background.
Well, what happened in 1984, after I'd been a judge for 2 years, the criminal dockets were overwhelming among the 3 courts, and the legislature wouldn't give us an additional court. So the then presiding judge just said, okay, well, you're going to hear nothing but criminal felony cases. You're going to, in essence, you're going to be the fourth criminal judge. And that went on for 9 years. Before it was not till, oh gosh, sometime in maybe 93 that I started to go back to doing some civil, but I continued to do criminal almost to the end, some criminal almost to the end, and ironically ended up trying 8 death penalty cases. I say ironically because I believe my criminal court colleagues, the most any one of them ever tried is 3. I don't mean that as in any way as criticism, but it's just it just shows you the depth of my involvement in criminal.
Is there a palpable difference from your years of experience in being a criminal court judge and being a civil court judge?
Well, I'd say yes. First of all, criminal law and the trial of a criminal case is more evidence heavy. The lawyers seem to be more up on evidence, and there are more objections, and the judge is continually tested. As you know, my wife, Ellen Lyle's a chancellor, and she oftentimes says that she goes through a whole chancery trial for 3 days and there's never an evidentiary objection. I mean, that may be an overstatement, but my feeling, but going back into civil, yes, that it's more evidence heavy. On the other hand, there are aspects of civil law that are more intellectually challenging. I mean, if you get I've had a class action case against Microsoft, fairly significant case between Cardinal and DuPont. Commercial code cases, and then when the legislature decided, or the Supreme Court decided we'd go to comparative fault, that set loose a number of sort of challenges about how to deal with that. So
yeah.
Now, I'm not to say circuit has less of those. I mean, Chancery does more commercial cases, but you can certainly, again, more intellectually challenging cases in bigger civil cases.
Comment a little bit about what you found in the, I guess about 16 years of circuit court judging before you became a senior judge. What's
26
the quality?
years.
Was it 26? I'm sorry, 26.
82 to 2008.
What comments do you have about the quality of practice here in Nashville or in Middle Tennessee, and changes in the law that you've seen over the years?
Well, you mentioned the senior judge. I'm going to mention that because it had something to do with the answer to your question. From 82 to early, or from 2008 till early 2013, I was a senior judge, and I traveled all over the state. So that gave me a comparison between Davidson County and other places. I mean, I held court in Knoxville, Chattanooga, and Memphis, so I've been in other big cities. I spent a lot of time in Knoxville in a pretty significant criminal case over there, but other things. And then I've been in 25 rural counties around as a senior judge. I mean, I'd say the Nashville bar is, good compared to the bar in some of the other metropolitan or cities. Now, you know, because you've been there, that once you get out of the big cities and you get into the country, things are a little more informal, and people are a little more friendly, even the lawyers, and I think there's a reason for that. Not only are they directly nice, but they practice in the same court before the same judge, and they live in the same smaller community with their other lawyers, and it's just a much more friendly, hospitable environment to be in. But, you know, I think here in Nashville, you do have, with a number of lawyers, you don't have the camaraderie that you once had, and the lawyers don't talk as much as they used to about, you know, informal discovery or even settlements of cases. There's not the closeness there used to be, and there's probably a higher percentage of lawyers that we'll just say are difficult to get along with. Having said that, I still think in comparison, this is still a pretty good place to practice, and that most lawyers are pretty reasonable to deal with.
What changes have you seen in law practice that strike you either as particularly good or particularly bad?
Well, I suppose the mediation, the coming of age of mediation, should be considered a positive. And if you can resolve a case that way, I think that's an affirmative. On the bad side, in the civil side, is the proliferation of disputes over discovery. I mean, the discovery can get more complicated than the lawsuit. And now we've got the computers and their memories and the phones and their memories all brought to court because you want to look at your opponent's emails, or you want to look at your opponent's text messages. And I must say, if you don't mind this aside, as a senior judge, I got to do a few divorces. There's some interesting stuff in divorce cases found on those iPhones.
I'm certain there is.
You know that.
You know, from all of this, from all of the experience that you've had. By the way, how did you become a senior judge? How does that happen?
Well, actually, the Chief Justice called me in late 2007 and said, you know, Walter, we've been looking for another senior judge. You've been down there a long time. And actually, let me say parenthetically, before that, they'd sent me down to Memphis, even before to do a terrible death penalty post-conviction, right, and called upon me to go into other counties. So that got, I said I'd think about it, and I then decided that, you know, I've been in this one place for 26 years. I was, I'd say for the 2 or 3 years before 2008,